everyone. Welcome yet again to our International Book Club. Thank you so much for joining us and enjoy the live recording. I think you all know by our excellent promotions from the wonderful Shai that we have the amazing Annie Garthwaite back with us. Welcome, Annie.
Hello, nice to see you again, Harriet.
Thank you so much. And I think you all know that we reviewed Annie's first book, Cecily, and it was very, very popular with you all. It's gone on to much acclaim. In fact, looking for a TV series as we speak. And out of that book came the most wonderful quote from the Sunday Telegraph: "Has the new Hilary Mantel arrived?" So you're in for a great session. Let me remind you a little bit about the wonderful Annie. She grew up in a very working class community in the northeast of England. She studied English at at the University of Wales before embarking on a 30-year international business career. She and I have that in common. And in 2017, she studied for an MBA in creative writing at Warwick. That's why I get Warwick and Wales mixed up. And during 2 years of study, wrote the amazing Cecily, which was published in 2021. It was the top pick for the Times and the Sunday Times, a best book. It's amazing. And what we're here today to talk about is her second book, The King's Mother. This has also gotten some very nice acclaim. It was only published in July the 11th, so we're not yet to the end of July, but she's already been named with The King's Mother in the Book of the Month. So let me stop chattering. Please get your questions up here. It's all the better, these interviews, when you ask the questions. And it's our International Book Club with Annie Garthwaite on The King's Mother. So let's kick off. Now, one of the most popular and important questions people ask is really, what was the inspiration for this book? i.e., how connected to Cecily is it? And did you do all your research in one go for Cecily, or was there a great deal more research for this, Annie?
Research is endless. I guess the idea for Cecily and the idea for The King's Mother have always been connected in my mind, in that if you put those two novels together, it is the story of the Wars of the Roses through the eyes of the women from beginning to end. And this book, I mean, the first book, Cecily, is very much about a single woman, Cecily Neville, the matriarch of the House of York. And it's the story of her as a young woman, I suppose. When we get to this book, Cecily is still center stage, absolutely, but it's really about the four big powerhouse women of the Wars of the Roses. So Cecily is joined by Marguerite of Anjou, Elizabeth Woodville, and Margaret Beaufort. And they really are the real power players during that period, during this period of time when the wars are at their absolute bloodiest height, I suppose. So that it's always been, they have always been connected in my mind, and they have always been the books that I've wanted to write. And so in a way, as with Cecily, I've been researching The King's Mother for 40 odd years, because that's when my fascination with these women and this story began. And all through my working life, I was fascinated by them. And that was my side, researching this novel was my side gig, I guess. And I just knew, I made a promise to myself when I started my business career in my 20s, that when I was 55, I would give up my day job and I would write this story, these books.
Fantastic.
But then in 2017, when I sat down to write Cecily, I sort of said, wow, I know this story now. I've researched it all. All I need to do is write it. But then the minute you sit down, you think, oh, I think I need to go and do some more research.
Yeah.
And the same with The King's Mother too. This one, starting to write The King's Mother took 2 years, just over 2 years. And I would say that 50% of that time was spent writing and 50% of that time was spent researching. And that's either reading sources or reading secondary commentaries on those sources, or interviewing historians, or getting involved in talking to all kinds of people, because although it's a book that's set in the 15th century, it deals with some pretty timeless issues like motherhood and war and envy and grief, and that involves a whole range of research that you might not expect. It's not research into the historical facts. But for example, I frequently sit down with psychologists to get a better understanding of my characters, particularly some of the more controversial characters in the books. So yes, research is endless, and you do a huge amount before you start writing, I guess, but it is an ongoing business when you're actually deep into the writing, because there's always more to find out.
Fantastic. And one of the questions that I know we like to set the scene, as you set the scene for The King's Mother, where are we and sort of what's happening? And weaving into that is the kind of character development, how you develop those characters. You just referred to the psychologists, etc., for the 4 women at the heart of this. So sort of set the scene for us.
Yeah. So the novel opens in 1461. And as it opens, the Yorkist dynasty has become, the House of York has become the royal house. So Cecily's eldest son, Edward, at the age of 18, has become the King of England. But as the book actually opens, Cecily herself is she's a bit stressed, Harriet.
Yes. Yeah.
Edward has just won a major battle in the west on the Welsh borders. He has come to London. He has accepted his throne. No time for a coronation or anything formal like that, because he's had to head north to fight another army that is waiting for him, an army that's twice the size of his, that he will be, the odds against success are bone-achingly slim.
Yes.
And he has gone north with his armies, leaving his mother in control of his new kingdom. And to me, that absolutely sets the scene for the tenor of the novel, that it is about the women, and it's about the women in power. And it is absolutely true that Edward did that. He left his kingdom in not in the control of one of his dukes or his captains or the blokes, his mother. And he made her effectively his regent. So while he's off fighting, Cecily's in London doing all the clever stuff, keeping all the plates spinning and all the balls in the air and holding everything together. And I guess, it's slightly a spoiler, but it happens in chapter 1, so not really. Edward wins, hurrah! And he comes back to London for his crowning, and then he is king. And you might say at that point that Cecily has achieved the apotheosis of power, because she is now the king's mother. But through the course of the novel, these 3 other women, Marguerite of Anjou, Elizabeth Woodville, and Margaret Beaufort, will each, at different times and in different ways and for different reasons, challenge for the throne themselves, challenge to put their boy on the throne and supplant Cecily as king's mother. So it's really about 4 women who end up being brought into conflict with one another.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting. This theme always comes up, the kind of relationship between the amazing research that you talked about, and fiction. And I think this is particularly relevant to the question of, you know, the four women at the heart of this. How much did you rely on historical research for their characters? How much did you breathe life into them, their similarities and their differences? I know that's quite a big question, but I think wrapped up together, it's quite central to why I think this book is amazing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, actually, because as ever with history, women have largely been ignored, or at least relegated to the sidelines of the action by a male-dominated historical tradition. Now, that's beginning to change, and I would say that in the last 20 years ago, there's been a resurgence in the history of women, largely led by female historians, as you might imagine. But even so, it's still tricky to uncover these women. And it's interesting, you know, I've been reading about these women and looking at these women for 40 years. And even so, it was years before, for me, the penny dropped. And I realized that these four women are intimately connected. And that sounds ridiculous. How could I not know that? But I think it's because the histories are written by men, about the men, and they only reference the women insofar as the women's actions impinge upon their men, or their menfolk. And, you know, Cecily is Edward's mom, and Margaret Tudor is Henry VII's mom, and Elizabeth Woodville is Edward's queen. And that's the extent of the male historian's interest in them.
Yeah.
But actually, these four women knew each other very well. They were part of a small elite group of aristocratic women at this time, and they were intimately connected. So with Marguerite of Anjou, who was the French queen of Henry VI, the king that Edward has now deposed at the beginning of this novel, she has known Cecily since she was 16 years old. They met when Marguerite was 16 years old, and she first came to England to marry Henry. And for a couple of decades, they were good friends and close associates, and they only became bitter enemies when, you know, the relationship between their husbands became irredeemable.
Yes.
Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's queen, is the daughter of a good friend of Cecily's, Jacquetta of Bedford. And Jacquetta and Cecily were both in France together for some time when they were both young, and at the time when they were, you know, childbearing, having lots of children. And so she would have known Elizabeth Woodville all her life. And Elizabeth was about 5 years older than her husband, Edward. And you could almost imagine a 5-year-old Elizabeth Woodville peering over the crib at the newborn Edward IV, you know. So they knew each other. And Margaret Beaufort, of course, and Cecily are cousins, because Margaret is a Beaufort and Cecily's mother was Joan Beaufort.
Yeah.
So to me, the fact that they are so close, they are so intimately related, they are so intertwined, makes the eventual betrayals and conflicts that arise between them all the more desperate and awful, because it's personal.
Yeah, isn't the word the British use, and I thought this so many times in the book, internecine. It's so personal, known. It's sort of politics at its most internecine. That so comes across, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not taking a pop at a distant enemy.
No.
You are sticking the knife in the ribs of someone you know well, and with whom you've been friends for many years, you know, and that's very different, isn't it? And I guess the big question for me in this novel, and I think the thing that brings it out of the 15th century and into the present, is, you know, the one thing these four women all have in common is that they are all mothers trying to protect and elevate their sons. And the big question the book asks is, what will a mother do for her son? Or put it another way, what won't she
do? Yeah.
Who will she not betray? What will she not put at risk? It ends up being a really short list.
There is an associated question for everyone who's just joined us. We have Annie Garthwaite, the writer of Cecily and now The King's Mother, talking to us about her latest book. We're talking about the internecine struggles of the main characters. Question for you that's come up, Annie, is, and you've just talked a little about it, to what extent you wrote this, and some of it is fiction, not all of it is purely documented historical fact. How much was it, do you believe, the elevation, protection of their sons, and how much was it that these women were so important in the history of our country at that time, and that they're playing out their own id, their own yin, their own yang, their own powerful force of being women in the limelight? Is it motherhood, or is it a chance at stardom?
That's fascinating, isn't it? It's where does that protection of your child become personal ambition, and do they come together at some point, and is there a grey area in between? And that's fascinating to me, because if you think about the traditional role of a aristocratic medieval woman, it is the elevation of her family. That is her task. She's the person who is the matriarch, who makes the marriages, who works to see her family constantly elevated. And as her family rises, so does she. And there's enormous pride taken in status and so on. So there are two things going on here, I think. When does it stop being, I am doing what I am doing to make my son safe, and if the place of safety happens to be the throne of England, that's what I'm going for? How much is it that? And how much is it personal ambition that they want that role of the premier woman in the kingdom, the king's mother? And it's interesting to me, when Edward IV became king, when Cecily's son became king, Cecily was the first woman ever to take upon herself formally the title of King's Mother. She said, from henceforth, I will be known not as the Lady Cecily, the Duchess of York, but Lady Cecily, the King's Mother. And she was the first woman to use that as a formal title rather than a biological fact, if you like. And that is absolutely, to my mind, a power play. It?
Oh, totally.
Don't for a minute think that I'm not the most important woman in the kingdom, right? It's me.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me, too, that eventually, when Henry VII becomes king after he's defeated the House of York at the Battle of Bosworth, his mother, Margaret Beaufort, adopts exactly the same role for herself and models her behavior in that role on that of Cecily, who she has known all of these years and has watched and studied. And she models her behavior on Cecily's, because she sees what an excellent job Cecily has done of inhabiting that premier female role. So and beyond that, she's married at the time to a guy called William Stanley, but she declares herself femme sole, which means single woman. So although she remains married, she operates in law and legally as a single and independent woman. And she backs that up with a vow of chastity.
Wow. Well, for those of you just joining and a couple have dropped off, we know you're going to buy the book. I'm here with Annie Garthwaite for the International Book Club, our review together. And one of the questions that always comes up, and has come up today, Annie, is about how do you actually write? You're a relatively not new writer, but you did another very big job for 30 years before. How do you write? Do you get blocked? Do you Tell us a little bit about the writing process, what works for you and how you deal with any challenges.
I think a 30-year career in business really helps with the writing. And that might sound counterintuitive, but what I think that gives you is an understanding that writing is work. It's not a hobby, it's work, it's graft. You can't afford to sit around waiting for inspiration to strike, or, for the muse to inspire. You just have to keep doing it. And some days you write all day and you don't write anything of value, not a single decent sentence.
Wow.
But that's as valid a writing day as any other. And on other days, you might end up with a paragraph you're pretty happy with, but you just have to keep doing it. So I'm very disciplined. When I'm writing, I am at my desk from 8:30 in the morning till about 6 o'clock at night, and I write. And it's usually, my writing day is usually a combination of writing and research, because, as I said, they do go hand in glove. But it's my business now. It's my work.
Yes.
And so I carry on with it. Writing book 2, I have to say, is a lot harder than writing book 1.
Really?
Yes. Yes, because I think when you're writing the first book, you're writing with the hope that it will be published, but not really with any expectation. And there's nobody out there expecting anything from you.
Yeah.
You're just writing in hope. But the second one, but once that book has been published and it's had some recognition and people have said, "Oh, are you writing another one? I can't wait." Suddenly there's all of that expectation. And there's the little monster that lives on your shoulder and goes, "Well, just because you can write one book doesn't mean you can write another one,
Yeah.
And it's, I guess it's what musicians call the tricky second album syndrome.
Yeah.
So I did hit a period around the middle of the novel where I felt I'd lost confidence in my ability to actually finish it.
Oh.
And it was quite panicky. But the only answer to that, and it isn't magic and it isn't clever, just keep going. Just keep going. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Knock that demon off your shoulder and just keep doing it.
So one of the questions that has popped up as well, which I really like, is just moving from our amazing female characters to Richard, and such a divisive, such a character, really, and probably, as you know, my primary degree is in medieval history, and the stories of the princes in the tower is one of the great, one of the major reasons some people study medieval history, that they might come across a text at one of the libraries or Senate House that helps solve that. But so much already written about the mighty Richard. How difficult was it to breathe life or breathe something into him?
It's hard, isn't it? Because he is such a divisive character. And it's almost impossible to say anything about Richard III without someone wanting to thump you. Because people either believe the tradition that he's a child murdering hunchback tyrant of Shakespeare, or he's a good guy who got a bad press and they can't bear to have a bad word said about him. The truth inevitably is somewhere in the middle, isn't it? Because that's what human beings are like. But the one thing I feel with Richard is that we've been given an impression of Richard which is based on post-war propaganda, I think, post-Wars of the Roses propaganda from the House of Tudor and promulgated by Shakespeare. And we need to get beyond that a bit. The thing that I feel about this is that most people who have any knowledge of Richard III at all are really only interested in the events of that summer in 1483, when his brother Edward dies. He is left as protector of Edward's two young sons, and within a matter of months, those sons have disappeared, and Richard has put himself on the throne of England. What happened in that 6 or 8 week period? Did he usurp the throne? Did he kill those boys? Who else did he kill? You know, the great mystery. What they never do is look at the previous 30, 31 years of life Richard had before he became king, to see what sort of a man he was and what sort of character he was, and what his behavior has been, his conduct has been. So I was very determined in writing about him to look at the whole Richard. And when you do, you get a strong sense of a very different man. You know, he was Cecily's youngest son, the last of 12 children. He was born at a time when Cecily and Cecily's husband was in desperate conflict with Henry VI. So he was born into the midst of war. One can't help feeling that he didn't get perhaps as much attention as the other, but you know, well, we've got Edward and we've got George, and then there's the girls, and then oh yeah, that one. What's his name? Oh yeah, Richard. The sort of slightly come lately son. Yeah. And I think he grew up in the shadow of his much more impressive, physically impressive brothers. I mean, famously, Edward IV was 6'4" tall and, you know, fabulous. And we know now from the examination of Richard's bones that he was a much smaller character, that he was slight, that he was dark. So he grew up in the shadow of much more glamorous brothers. But nonetheless, his conduct through his life was quiet, steady, diligent, dutiful, loyal to a fault to his brother Edward, really, even when it meant putting himself in extreme personal danger. And where his brother George was treacherous and betrayed Edward constantly, Richard was kind of the rock upon which Edward relied. He ruled the north for him. He was something of a lawyer. He reformed our legal system. You know, the fact that in this country we are now innocent until we are proved guilty, well, that was a statute put on the law book by Richard III, because he had such a strong sense of right and wrong. So one of the things that I did in my research was to look at Richard's earlier life and conduct, particularly how he'd conducted himself at times of great pressure, danger, and stress. And then sat down with some psychologists and said, okay, given we know this of Richard, now let's put him in the summer of 1483, when he's never been under more pressure. He's got the responsibility of the protectorship. The French are about to invade. The factions are rising in England that threaten his protectorship. Based on what we know about him, how is he going to react, and how is he going to respond? And their input was so valuable. And I'm not going to tell you what they said, and therefore, you know, because
you have to read the book.
You have to read the book. But it is perhaps a more informed view than Shakespeare's.
Fantastic. Well, you see, that's a great quote from today already. Annie Garthwaite, a slightly more informed view than William Shakespeare. We're coming to the last couple of questions, Annie, if we may. But you mentioned this a little bit earlier. We're interviewing Annie Garthwaite for the International Book Club. And this is a historical novel with, I think, great contemporary relevance. But if there was one thing, if people were saying, well, it all sounds a bit historical to me, you know, I'm in Kuala Lumpur, or I'm in downtown Manila, you know, is this really, how is it relevant? What's the one thing that you think everyday ordinary folk like us can really get from this wonderful book?
Yeah. Well, you know, is this a book about a 15th century civil war in England. Yeah, I suppose it is, but not really. This is a book about mothers and sons. And whether you know the history of the 15th century or care about it, that is a timeless subject, I think, and one that can grip all of us. And I think it's also a novel about how women exercise power in a world where men seem to hold all the power cards.
Well, if
And
that
I think that's where we still are today.
Absolutely. And if that doesn't, in the context of the elections in North America, as we look at our newly formed government, it's even more relevant in a sense as we enter the second half of this decade. Now, what is people are asking? So, got Cecily. We're going to be out there trying to find who plays Cecily as this goes to the very big and also the smaller screen on TV. The King's Mother has been launched and already is selling well and getting great reviews. What's next? Annie Garthwaite, are you going to take a little vacation? I suspect not, but tell us what's next for you.
Well, that was a big question for me because, as I said, these two books have been in my head for so long. And I did find myself thinking, as I was coming to the end of writing The King's Mother, is that it? Am I done now? Do I go and have another career, start something else? Or do I now want to be a novelist? Is this my future? And I was having lunch with my editor and she asked me, she said, so Annie, have you got an idea in your mind for a third book? And I found myself saying, oh, well, there's this woman, Isabella, who's quite interesting. And she is, and I described Isabella to her, and Isabella was the queen of Edward IV, who, as far as kings go, was pretty near the top of the useless pile. And she eventually deposed him. Yeah. And so the sort of French queen who brings down an English king.
Yeah.
And my editor said, we'll contract that right now. And I suddenly found myself signing a contract to write this book. So I thought,
whoa!
I must want to be a novelist then. Right. Okay.
Fantastic.
So yeah, there is a third book on the way. It's going to be a while. I've got a heap of research to do.
Well, the hundreds of folks that have joined us today, and you all know we replay this in about a week's time with a little summary of what makes this another great book. Annie, you're always such a pleasure to talk to. You're so open about your writings. I can say I loved Cecily, and I personally love The King's Mother more because I do not personally believe that we will ever have equality until there are as many really bad women as there are good in power. And so this is one of the very few books, I think, that truly explores the range of, well, as you say, the lengths that women will go to, not only to protect their sons, but to manifest their own intelligence and their own well-being. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Go out and buy this book, everyone.
Yes, go out and buy this book.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Annie. We really appreciate all of your inputs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been great to talk to you, Harriet.
Thank you.